Instead of focusing on building tanks, planes, and weapons, resources were wasted on non-essential goods and extravagant projects like Hitler's architectural ambitions. With just 300 U-boats, Britain could have been brought to her knees. A system of command in which decisions are made by one man, contrary to military logic, was bound to collapse. World War II was not only the largest conflict in history, but also one where decisions, sometimes made in moments, changed the fate of nations. But what if things had gone differently? Today, we'll explore the regrets and reflections of high-ranking Nazi officials who believed that, with different choices, the course of the war could have turned in Germany's favor. From strategic miscalculations to logistical blunders, Nazi leaders themselves admitted to crucial mistakes. Their words, captured after the war, reveal how close some believed they were to victory and how far-reaching their errors were. Could the tide of the war really have been turned? Let's find out. Heinz Guderian, known as the father of Blitzkrieg, played a crucial role in Germany's early successes. His strategy of fast, coordinated attacks using tanks, infantry, and air support devastated Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But Guderian believed Germany's greatest mistake came in the invasion of the Soviet Union. He advocated for a single, focused push toward Moscow in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. Guderian argued that capturing the Soviet capital would have shattered the USSR's political and logistical heart, crippling their ability to fight back. Instead, Hitler diverted resources to Ukraine and Leningrad, delaying the advance and allowing the Soviets to regroup. The capture of Moscow would have brought the Eastern Campaign to a successful conclusion. The delay proved fatal. By the time the German army reached Moscow's outskirts, winter had set in, and the poorly equipped troops faced not only fierce Soviet resistance, but freezing temperatures that halted their advance. Guderian later lamented that this misstep, dictated by Hitler's obsession with territorial gains, cost Germany its best chance to win in the East.
Stalin is asking for one last effort!
Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, was a brilliant tactician who openly clashed with Hitler over the Führer's erratic and illogical orders. Halder was particularly critical of Hitler's decisions during the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most catastrophic defeats for Germany. Halder believed that the siege of Stalingrad was an unnecessary diversion. He argued that the Sixth Army should have been used to support other fronts or retreat to consolidate German forces. But Hitler's refusal to allow retreat led to the encirclement and eventual destruction of the Sixth Army. A system of command in which decisions are made by one man, contrary to military logic, was bound to collapse. Halder's disagreements with Hitler didn't end there. His warnings about splitting forces during Barbarossa and overextending supply lines also went unheeded. Ultimately, his outspokenness led to his dismissal in 1942. Many historians argue that Halder's strategic mind could have saved Germany from several disastrous campaigns had his advice been followed.
There will be no withdrawal on the Eastern Front, not 1 inch. Every German soldier will hold or die where he stands.
Hope for a turn in the tide.
Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later reflected on Germany's failure to prepare for a long war. At the start of the conflict, the Nazi economy wasn't fully mobilized for war production. Instead of focusing on building tanks, planes, and weapons, resources were wasted on non-essential goods and extravagant projects like Hitler's architectural ambitions. Speer admitted that Germany's delayed shift to total war production was a critical mistake. He said, "Had we mobilized the economy fully in 1939, our military could have been far better equipped to sustain the war." The Allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, massively outproduced Germany in tanks, planes, and artillery. This industrial disparity became a deciding factor, especially after 1942, when Germany faced a two-front war against overwhelming numbers.
Also Sie fahren. Gut. Auf Wiedersehen.
Ich wünsche Ihnen alles Gute.
Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's navy, believed that the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic could have crippled Britain. He reflected that if Germany had started the war with at least 300 operational submarines, the Royal Navy's supply lines could have been cut off entirely. Dönitz's U-boats came dangerously close to achieving this in 1941, during what became known as the Wolfpack attacks. German submarines sank millions of tons of Allied shipping, threatening Britain's survival. However, the lack of enough submarines at the start of the war limited the campaign's impact. With just 300 U-boats, Britain could have been brought to her knees. As the war progressed, Allied advancements in radar, sonar, and convoy tactics turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic, neutralizing the U-boat threat. Dönitz's vision of starving Britain into submission was never fully realized. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was one of Germany's most brilliant military minds. Like Guderian, Manstein believed that the failure to prioritize Moscow during Barbarossa was a fatal error. He argued that Moscow was not just a political center, but a vital transportation hub. Capturing it could have paralyzed Soviet logistics. Manstein also criticized Hitler's no-retreat orders, which turned manageable setbacks into devastating losses. For example, during the winter of 1941-42, German forces were forced to hold their positions despite freezing conditions and Soviet counterattacks. If Moscow had fallen, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. Manstein's later campaigns, including his counteroffensive in Ukraine in 1943, demonstrated his tactical genius. But by then, Germany's resources were stretched too thin, and the opportunity to win the war had passed. From Halder's frustrations with Hitler's strategic blunders to Speer's admissions about economic mismanagement, it's clear that the Nazis made critical mistakes that could have been avoided. But as we reflect on these what-ifs, we must also remember the atrocities committed by this regime.